Alors, bonjour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable.
Bonjour.
Hello also to those who are watching us live on Facebook. It's an immense pleasure to be here today with you, with all of you today, and to be able to hear your comments.
You are watching live on Facebook. It is a great pleasure to be here with all of you today and to have the opportunity to listen to your insights. Je suis la sénatrice.
I am Senator Lucie Moncion, and I am a member of the Senate Committee on Official Languages. Senator Cormier and I come from two different regions. We both deeply care about official languages in Canada. Senator Cormier is from New Brunswick, and me, I'm from Ontario. I am a Franco-Ontarian from Ottawa, and I've lived here for more than 20 years in the northeastern part of the province. In Ontario, the Franco-Ontarian community is flourishing and dynamic, and we're proud of our language and our culture. I think as all of you are as well. You're very proud of your languages and of your culture, and also of the work you are doing to preserve our language and to grow it. The members of the Francophone community in Ontario have their own type of French, and they interact easily in both official languages.
Is extremely practical. Bilingualism is an asset to employers, for instance, particularly here in Ottawa. But it is also a gateway to getting to know other people and cultures. It makes life richer. I'm so happy to meet all of you and look forward to hearing your comments. Vous avez un don et
you have a clear talent and passion for languages, and I hope that you will be able to benefit from it throughout your lives, both professional and personal. We are looking forward to what you have to tell us. Our committee is looking at potential modernization of the Official Languages Act, and your experience and ideas will provide us with invaluable insight. The Official Languages Act, as you probably know, will be 50 in 1919. For us, we think this is quite young. But when the question of the modernization of the OLA was mentioned, the committee members felt that it was essential to hear the viewpoints of people such as you, who are between 14 and 25 years of age, and who can give us new, innovative ideas to meet the needs of today. This roundtable is a great opportunity to give you a chance to speak, but before doing so, I'd like to invite Senator René Cormier to say a few words. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd also like to welcome you to this roundtable, which is live on Facebook. I think this is the first that we're doing this, so this is thanks to you. It will be able to hear your stories at the Senate of Canada. As Senator Moncion said, I'm also a member of the Committee on Official Languages. And as you perhaps know, New Brunswick is the only officially bilingual province in Canada. Although both linguistic communities in my province face certain challenges, we are enriched by the presence of both official languages in Canada.
Diversity of culture and brings different visions of the world in our lives. In other words, both Molière and Shakespeare can be our friends, and we can enjoy Pascal Lejeune and David Miles on the same stage at the same time. Of course, it obviously opens the door to more meaningful interaction with Canadians across the country. Si cette réalité-là,
although this is true in New Brunswick, it's also true elsewhere. But this is not the case for all Canadians. Our committee's most recent report on access to education in French as a first and second language, it underscores the various challenges that are still present in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada. The lack of school infrastructure, overcrowded and schools in poor condition, do not allow students in British Columbia to fully benefit and extend from French. And so we would like to renew our commitment to the promotion of both official languages in Canada. The Official Languages Act is supposed to promote the use of French and promote the use of French and English in Canada. However, this act was adopted almost 50 years ago, before internet, cell phones, and personal computers. So the objectives of this act remain important, and they're at the very basis of our social contract that created our country 150 years ago. Obviously, Canada has evolved considerably since this act was created, and that is why it has to be adapted to the reality of the 21st century. And that is why we want to get Canadians involved in modernizing this act.
Today, we need your help, your ideas, and your energy. Nous avons besoin de mieux connaître.
We need to know your viewpoints. What is your reality with both official languages in your community? What does it mean in your daily life, in your public interactions, at school, in your cultural associations, in your various organizations, in terms of your own personal identity? What should we improve or change? And what's the federal government's role in this, so you can fully benefit from both official languages? Here are some of the questions that we have. Once again, I'd thank you for being here today. So, without further ado, I invite the president of the Fédération to present his members of his delegation. Thank you very much, Senator Cormier, Senator Moncion, and Senator Cormier. We'd like to thank you very warmly for this invitation to be here today. And this is the second invitation we had to appear before this Senate committee, which is studying the modernization of the Official Languages Act. We appeared before this Senate committee in May, and we gave you a general overview about our initiatives and the challenges we face. But today, it's something a little more special, because we're around this beautiful table with young youth throughout the country in the various provinces and territories in Canada. And today, you're going to hear about the challenges, and you're going to hear viewpoints from the ground. So I'm very happy to be here today with my colleagues who come from various regions in Canada to talk about this. People often say, when they talk about youth, we talk about the future. But we also have to talk about the present. And if we want to define our future, we have to be committed today to this. And that is why we're here today. And we thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to express our opinions. And this is a unique opportunity, so thank you very much for this. Our association thinks that the vitality of francophone communities in minority milieu requires committed youth that is able to instore change throughout the country. Francophone communities have a role to play to advance the overall society in Canada. So what I would wish, and what my colleagues wish as well, is to be able to contribute to this society and to this future. Bilingualism, as Senator Cormier said, is a fundamental value for our country. And we have to improve it and remind people. We have to promote this fundamental value of our society. So on this note, I would give the floor to my colleague. And once again, thank you very much for this invitation. My name's Martin Kramer. I'm from Alberta. I was asked to present today my own personal experience, and my own personal experience in the Francophone community was very privileged. It's one of the reasons why I'm here today, no doubt. So I'd like to talk about the 40,000 youth in Alberta and in my association. Of course, I love to talk about myself, but there's no just one Franco-Albertan reality. I have my own, and it's different for every Franco-Albertan. So the Act is right now intended to promote the equality and use of French throughout the country. So I think right now, with the Franco-Albertan reality, it's not realistic to think that we can think this is going to happen. Here's one reason. First, if you take the example of our school board right now, our Francophone school board, many of the young students who enter JK need French language support. So we need this support to be able to enhance French language in our province in order to retain the Franco-Albertan culture. So they are at a disadvantage in relation to their English-speaking friends. There are also a lot of infrastructure that's missing. In Alberta, there are more than 700 post-secondary students. I think I'm privileged because I was able to study many years at university in French. 17% of Franco-Albertans are immigrants. And there was an increase in the number of Albertans who have French as their mother tongue between 2006 and 2011. We have a partnership with other centres to welcome new arrivals to our province, and the objective is to be able to welcome new arrivals to our Canadian school system. The Director General of the school board already told me that if all the grants to this program were to disappear, he would find the funding from his own funding. So bilingualism in Alberta depends on immigration, so we have to bear this in mind. In conclusion, the future of French and in bilingualism in Alberta depends on institutions such as the St. John campus. We open our doors and we tell everyone who crosses these doors that you can live in French in Alberta. We're going to say this to old stock Francophones and to new French-speaking Canadians as well. But not enough youth in our province hear this message, and if you want to increase the number of people who hear this message that you can actually live in French in Alberta, we have to get the message out to all French speakers, both old and new, that we can live in French in Alberta. Thank you very much. You are the president of your committee, and your region will definitely be happy to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much. Mr. Louis Hiro from British Columbia. Thank you very much, Senators, for receiving us here today. As you know, I'm from BC. I was born in Quebec, and I've been in BC for 10 years. And I'm able to integrate completely into the French community in my province. In BC, the situation is somewhat different in our region. We say that all young people are bilingual. They don't necessarily have a Francophone identity that's very strong. I'll come back to that point later. But the fact that everyone thinks they're more or less bilingual or Francophone makes it hard to reach everyone. For example, the French school board for our province, most of our students come from this school board, and there are 5,000 young people in this board. However, in the French immersion program, only 10% of our participants come from this. So there are really long waiting lists for these programs. There is a lot of interest in learning French. People want to learn French, but we have to make a distinction between francophones and those who want to learn French, and this is problematic. But what we do, we don't really make a distinction. People in Quebec and BC don't necessarily make a distinction between those who speak French fluently and those who are interested in learning French. So this is important to note. But for those who don't participate in our activities and to attend immersion programs, so they often don't feel confident in their ability to speak French, and they don't necessarily seek out a career or an education in French. So this is one of the symptoms of the lack of support for French or for post-secondary programs in French. There's only a poli-sci program in French, and it's very small. So this also undermines linguistic security. In BC, this is one of our challenges. Many of the active members of our community come from Quebec or France, and it's hard to reach out to those who really come from BC because perhaps they're in immersion programs, or they are insecure about their language abilities. So many francophones in BC don't identify with the francophone community. So this is one of the challenges that's really hard to overcome. Our youth council is trying to include more people and a greater variety of people. And this happens by creating a francophone identity. And this is really hard to do, obviously. So what we need in BC is a system that encourages people to speak French. And for those who are rights holders and others, it's tougher. There's a distinction to be made between those who are interested in learning French and those who actually speak French. So youth organizations such as ours try to work on this. So we need more resources to create this link, and we need more post-secondary programs in French. That would really be helpful because young people often do primary school in French or an immersion program in post-secondary, and then if they don't practice French, they lose some of their ability. So these problems are somewhat linked to a lack of leadership in the provincial government. There's no real policy in French for French in BC. We have a total of 2 employees on this file. So it means that there's a lack of motivation on behalf of the provincial government. So this is problematic. There's also a lack of funds and spaces in schools, not just for the school board in general, but also for the immersion programs, and that's why there's so many long waiting lists. And this is perhaps related to the lack of the census issues. French is, some people only think French is a language spoken in BC if it's your first language. That's really interesting what you're saying. We had a study that was tabled on this problem in BC. Our Official Languages Committee worked on this subject, so we're aware of these problems, which are very important, and we're happy to hear you mention them as someone who's concerned by these problems and involved by them. Mr. Gill from PEI, thank you very much, Senators. As you can tell, I have an Anglophone family, but I'm still a very proud Acadian. This may not be the case for all Francophones in PEI, but I'll tell you the history of our youth organization. The Acadian Youth Association, for 40 years, was working very well. In recent years, as youth in the province started to learn French, many of them weren't from Acadia, but they were from other provinces or countries, or there were even Anglophones interested in learning French. So we decided to change our name to better reflect the nature of all the francophones. So we're very proud of our new name, Francophone and Acadian Youth Association. So we want to make sure that everyone is included. One of our challenges some of our students in immersion programs never had the opportunity to speak French. And they find it easier to speak in English rather. And sometimes we feel the necessity to speak to them in English to be polite. But young people want to learn French, and they try to find ways to better use French. However, since we don't have a large Francophone community in PEI, it is difficult to use French throughout the day, all day.
Dur pour nos jeunes.
So that makes it hard for our youth. One of the things we're looking at from the Senate Committee is to recognize the importance of the Francophone network and the identity pathway of youth for those in minority situations. We also want to send the message to the government and foster the creation of a budget to ensure permanent jobs in those Francophone associations in minority settings. For example, we talk a lot about employees for more stable or better paid jobs. Our youth need staff in those youth organizations. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl Gill from Prince Edward Island. And now, Mr. Bentley from Manitoba. Thank you very much for the invitation, Honorable Senators. In Manitoba, in our federation, we've always trying to push the boundaries. We want to use words that reflect Francophone youth. We talk about Francophone lovers instead of Francophiles. We talk about linguistic security instead of linguistic insecurity. That makes a huge impact. We want to better represent this evolving youth. In 2016, it's been said that since 2005 we are dreaming big, opening our doors to French immersion courses. And we have a board with an equal part Francophone and Anglophone members. I was in immersion up to the 9th grade, and then I studied law. I was never able to speak French at home. I know someone who wasn't able to speak at home in French. Me and my friends have a passion for French, but we are seen differently, as if there were better Francophones and less than better Francophones. Some are still learning, some want to learn, but for us that hierarchy is totally superficial. We want to preserve French in minority settings by debunking this myth. Social policies and government policies must help us, but we need to redefine what is a Francophone in the eyes of the government. We need a broader definition to include more people. All those who speak French should have access to French services, which is not always the case right now. We want a rich and diverse francophonie with all types of accents throughout Canada. We want a wider francophone community than ever imagined. From coast to coast to coast, going by Montreal and elsewhere, we want inclusive projects so that francophones can innovate, cook in French, play soccer in French, and debate in French. French should be a medium and not an and in itself. We must trust ourselves and offer services to other organizations. So we hope the Senate will give deep thought to what the French is nowadays, how it evolved in the last 50 years, and how we can promote it for the anniversary of the Official Languages Act. Thank you. You have a very good French. I like the message of inclusivity that you are sending for all Francophone communities in Canada, whether we speak perfect French or just some French. Thank you very much. Mr. Couturier. Senators, it's a great pleasure for me to be here as Vice President of my federation in New Brunswick. I know that your committee has heard a lot about the bridging the gap of our two communities. I was born in a minority setting in Fredericton where only 10% of the population speak French. I will also talk about the importance of our organizations and of building our youth identity. Even if the language of work in my school is French, a lot of people speak English in the hallways because a great majority of students speak English. But with drama, theater, shows of an Acadian flavor, we try to make our mark. Some individuals find it difficult, think that bridging the gap is hard to do. And since many members of the Anglophone community go to our schools, they don't necessarily bridge that gap, which makes it harder for those who come from a more Francophone minority setting. One summer I went to my grandfather's cottage. We would take small breaks, little breaks, but it was those breaks were constantly getting longer. At one point, I asked why my skin was darker than those at my school, and I was told that it's because of the elders. And then my grandfather kept on explaining that some of my ancestors were deported during the Great Deportation of Acadians. Many years later, the Fédération of Francophones of New Brunswick finally opened my eyes to what Acadia was. It's a vibrant community, a provincial community where I often go, and my preconceived ideas were finally shattered in that federation. I finally learned what was Acadia. But it's not the case for everyone. For many youth, that minority setting is often leads them nowhere. That's why we must talk about bridging the gap between our two communities of official languages. It is good to want to get closer, to exchange and better know ourselves, but how can we do that if we don't know ourselves? So I spent a month in a completely Anglophone environment. Some asked me where I learned French. I told them about my Acadian roots. I had confidence because of that Francophone Federation in New Brunswick, whose mission is to build our Francophone youth identity through culture and by bridging the gap with the Anglophone community. I hope that more youth will be able to take part in our events, and in doing so, being able to open a dialogue with the Anglophone community. Here's one of my most famous quotes from Antonio Gramsci. Those who don't know where they're going or don't know where they come from don't know where they're going. Thank you very much. You are providing many insights in how we can bridge that gap between those cultures in our different regions. Thank you very much for your intervention. Mr. Fraser from Nova Scotia now. Honorable Senators, thank you very much. I would like to tell you about my reality, but also the reality of my community in Nova Scotia. At first, I hated French. Honestly, up until 6th grade, I found that stupid to must speak French. But finally, I took part in the 35th Games in Bathurst, where I found an Acadian community that was vibrant. And that's what inspired me. I did not identify as Acadian at first, but it happened. I started to get involved in my community, and that's why I'm here. I chose French instead of English. That's not to say that I don't speak English. My family is totally Anglophone, and most times they won't be able to say it in French. But I have friends who are able to speak good French and who have ancestors who were Francophones. The reality is that in Nova Scotia, we have a great diversity of Francophones. If you go to the Clore region, where there's the only Francophone university in our province, you will hear an accent that I don't understand. In Chetikan, the same. I'm getting a bit better at it, but not that much. Those are good ways to speak French. They're able to communicate much faster than I can with other Francophones. So kudos to them. There are also fascinating communities because they love to speak French without even being able or needing to take part in these great events. They understand the value of speaking French. That's what I'd like you to consider when making legislation. We don't only need acts saying we must speak French, but we must understand the importance of that language. We should offer opportunities. Students shouldn't be ashamed of speaking French in a bit of a weird way. If we understand each other, that's fine. So why not push ourselves to get better? It is also a reality that in Nova Scotia, all those part of the provincial school board know it too well. all too well. We are losing the students. It's the same probably everywhere. We have like 5 graduates a year. There was only 1 3 years ago. Despite of our pride in French and speaking French, I think we should promote that pride of speaking French. And I can tell you that our message sometimes is heard at the highest levels. And let's be proud of our Moncton and Acadian heritage. Congratulations. Yes, this language is very important. Thank you for your insights. And now, we give the floor to Pablo Sandoval. Honorable Senators, colleagues, I'm honored and privileged to be able to speak here before so many distinguished Canadians from all across the country. I can say that I'm motivated by French. Coming from a Syrian father and a Chilean mother, we only speak Spanish at home, but being born in Montreal, I was able to live in French and learn French. We all value French in all the different provinces of Canada. Each and every one of my colleagues understand the vitality, the need for a French language that is vibrant. Our community in Ontario is in somewhat of a favorable position, but we still have a limited access to post-secondary education in French. We ask to have a larger territory included for francophone services, among other topics. I was marked by this history that is showing that there's shame in how our minority was treated. Last summer, a participant in one of our events admitted that they never wanted to speak French with their mother, who's a francophone from Ontario. They would even avoid to invite friends over because their mother would talk in French. But nowadays, I'm proud to say that this person now speaks to their mother in French every day.
This is what makes me proud of the work of the Fédération. This troubling insecurity is only one symptom of the reality that being a francophone outside of Quebec is difficult, be it in terms of education, services, media representation, the place one has in society as a whole. The movement for an officially bilingual capital is also a pressing issue. Last May 31st, over 1,000 demonstrators, mostly young people from Ottawa, marched through Ottawa because they wanted it to become officially bilingual. It took a lot of logistics and a great deal of organization, and these are qualities which make young francophones forced to be contented with politically. Today's meeting Today's meeting describes the reality faced by many francophones outside of Canada. For many years, we have worked at promoting French, and I'm pleased to keep on working at promoting French with partners and other people who care about the French language. Thank you very much, Mr. Pablo Sandoval. It's a real pleasure for me to pronounce your name at a round table on official languages and on the diversity of the French language in this country. From the very start, we've had the pleasure of being exposed to the different expressions of French. Thank you for your speech. And since we're talking about diversity, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Gabriela from Saskatchewan. Thank you to the two senators. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you and with my colleagues. As you know, as you can hear through my family name, my family is originally from El Salvador. I speak Spanish, English, and French in that order. So my mother tongue is Spanish. I learned French when I went to French school, and I learned English because it's in the air. I learned it by osmosis. It's easy to learn. I'm very proud to identify not only as a Hispanophone, but as a Francophone from Saskatchewan. Thanks to my education in the French school system in my province, I've had opportunities some of my friends and colleagues have not had. Not everyone can represent their own province within the Fédération de la jeunesse canadienne-française. Not everyone has the opportunity to sit on an administration committee of an organization by and for young people. I'm very lucky to have had these experiences and to have a feeling of belonging from a young age. Most young people in my province don't have this feeling of belonging. In Saskatchewan, the reality is that we cannot flourish in both official languages. In the province, French is a headache and not an asset. We need federal legislation to strengthen linguistic duality in Saskatchewan. I do not want to speak to yet another bureaucrat in Saskatchewan who will get mad at me for demanding service in French. I don't like dealing with airport officials who get mad at me for speaking French after they address me with hello, bonjour. Just because I speak French in public, I don't like being humiliated. I don't want to hear French people in Francophone and immersion programs say that they don't want to speak French anymore because they don't feel secure enough, confident enough to do so. So as you can tell, there is no linguistic duality in Saskatchewan. We're lucky that there is a cité universitaire in the University of Regina. There are French classes, but they're limited. So young students graduating from immersion programs who want to keep on studying in French have to go to the University of Regina or elsewhere. But not everyone can do this. If young people don't have the money to study elsewhere, they have to study in Saskatchewan, and they'll have to study in English. We're also lucky to have French organizations in Saskatchewan to make sure that the French language doesn't disappear. But it's often not enough. The French community in Saskatchewan is asking you to let the province know how important French is. You can do this through an awareness campaign or through various activities which explain to young people that it's an advantage to speak French, even if you're not a Francophone. In summary, Saskatchewan is losing French, but it will only benefit from the modernization of the Official Languages Act. Thank you, Gabriela. These are extremely important and interesting observations, especially when it comes to linguistic duality. In the word duality is the word duel. It shouldn't be a duel or a fight. Both languages should complement each other, and this is what makes Canada a much more rich country. Amélie Latour from the Yukon. Good afternoon, Honourable Senator Moncion and Honourable Senator Cormier. as you've just said. I'm from the Yukon. I live in Whitehorse, the capital of the territory. Myself and about 38,000 other people are surrounded by gorgeous mountains and a beautiful river. But of those 38,000 people, about 4.8% are francophones. So we speak French as a mother tongue. 13% of all of those people can speak and understand French. I had the opportunity to grow up in a francophone community. We're all very close to each other. We organize activities, and we really live in French. But it's really important, and I've seen this over the last few years, to get these francophones out of the territory so that they can see how the francophonie operates elsewhere in Canada, and so they can strengthen their own francophone identity. The reason why young people need to leave their province, rather their territory, leave the Yukon, is because there's only one French school. It goes from pre-kindergarten to grade 12. We're all in the same building. Yet there are not enough resources. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have access to all the courses we'd like to take because when they hit high school, most students decide to study in English and not to continue in French, or they might want to study or choose to study in French immersion. So it's a really good thing that young francophones living in the Yukon can go to other francophone communities. It's important that they perceive themselves as francophones, to be proud as such, to be able to speak French, because after all, they are francophiles. In 2019, we are supposed to get our own francophone high school. We've been told for several years now that it will happen, that we'll have our own francophone high school, but it hasn't happened yet. If it happens in 2019, that would be great, but it's not a done deal. It's very important for me to talk about the project, though. And again, thank you so much for taking of your time to listen to us. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to each and every one of you for sharing your experiences with us. Your testimony is quite touching, actually, because each of you is living a different reality at home. We need to hear about your experiences, because this is what will help us modernize the Official Languages Act, and this is what will help us find solutions to meet the various needs which have been raised. We will ask you to please stay in touch.
Will help us in our work at the Senate. Together, we can build a better Official Languages Act that is respectful of both official languages and that promotes bilingualism in the 21st century. J'ai maintenant le plaisir d'annoncer le début de la période de questions. Et pour ce faire,
we'll now go to questions and answers, and we'd ask people in the audience to don't be shy. Please come forward and ask your questions. If I may, before Q&A starts, Senator Moncion just said some very touching things, but important things. We talked about creating a francophone space, linguistic insecurity, rights holders and immersion students. You talked about the need for events. You talked about the link between language and culture. These are very important issues which have to do with the reality of official language minority communities, and which are all issues that are relevant to the modernization of the Official Languages Act. As we said at the beginning, we'd ask you to please raise your hands if you wish to ask a question, and Marcy is going to come and get you and bring you to the microphone. So now the floor is to anyone who wishes to ask a question. Good afternoon. honorable senators. Thank you so much for welcoming us so warmly today. My name is Colin Philippe Biliveau-Simard. I'm from Alberta. I'm the outgoing president of francophone jeunesse en Alberta. I have a couple of questions, and I really had to think hard about which questions I wanted to ask you, so I'll be brief. First, I believe that anyone who listens to the news in Canada, especially television news, will quickly realize that minority communities are not on the radar, or rather issues that are on the radio. This is true at the CBC and on other English media platforms. However, it's also true that also applies to Radio-Canada. But we still are very lucky to have TFO and Radio-Canada because we get our news in French from these stations. That said, I think that for someone like myself who is lucky enough to get news from these francophone platforms, it's still not easy for me to get news in French at home, so locally. How can, rather, given that there's so little news about minority francophone language communities of Canada, how can young Anglophones know about our realities? Basically, we're invisible. I would like to know what the committee intends to do to increase the visibility of French in minority communities in the public discourse, in government discourse, and on digital media platforms. Well, thank you for your question. Senator, I'll begin by answering. We are going to meet with certain groups, our target groups, if you will, including all federal institutions. And we are going to talk about communications. This is part of our mandate. And in our consultations, we are going to talk about the issues you've just raised. That's quite clear that this will be part of our study. Our study, which is ongoing, will table a report with the government. The report will call on the government to modernize the Official Languages Act. The report will call on the government to take measures to find concrete solutions to the issues you are raising. It's not the first time we've heard about these problems, and we experience these issues every day. It's very important for us to raise the profile of minority language communities. But I have a question for you. What do you think we should do? What do you think the federal government should do to strengthen the relationship between the federal government and minority language communities on the ground? How can we strengthen the French mandate of Radio-Canada, CBC, and other institutions? One of the objectives of our consultation is to hear from people like yourself. Well, to add to that, if you look at Anglophone or Francophone media, they're reporting natural disasters. They're not covering language issues because the language issues are not covered like a natural disaster would. So in the course of our consultations, when we talk to representatives from government organizations, we're going to ask them, what are they going to do? I also like the approach proposed by my colleague, the senator, who has asked you, what kind of training do you want? What kind of platform would you like to receive your French services on? Because some platforms are funded by the government. If I may add, these issues are very important. Anything that has to do with communications, Radio-Canada and CBC, they're quite obvious. But we are also going to be looking at new media. How is it that in the digital area, and given everything coming down the pipe in terms of Canadian content, how can we make sure that Francophone content is disseminated more widely? How can we make it more accessible to your generation? I don't know if you have any ideas on this. Well, I didn't really talk about social media or digital platforms, but as the government knows, online bullying is something that affects youth today. Around the table today, we also talked about language security or insecurity. In the case of minority French language communities, it's very important to have a presence on social media. We have to launch initiatives to create a Francophone digital space, a virtual space. We have to let people know that it's okay to share anything they want to in French without suffering any kind of reprisal. Does anyone else want to speak to this issue? Communication? What you're also talking about is the relationship between the federal government, the Official Languages Act, the implementation of the Act, and the accountability of federal institutions. What does Radio-Canada, what do federal institutions have to do to respect their obligations under the Official Languages Act? It is their responsibility to promote the Act. That's a very important matter, and thank you so much for raising it. Clearly, we're open to any suggestions you might have to help us make recommendations to the government. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Good afternoon, Senators. It's such a pleasure to sit down with you. I actually listened carefully to everything was said. Yes, my name is Ms. Duguay. I'm from New Brunswick. During the entire discussion, I was thinking about how governments position themselves on this issue. Again, I live in New Brunswick. I am really pleased that we have linguistic duality. Things are going fairly well, but as a Canadian citizen, as I believe that we elect our representatives because we trust them. We do so, obviously, once we've hit the age of majority. We want our MPs to properly represent us. However, as a Francophone, I sometimes feel that the government is afraid of the reaction of Anglophones if the government fought too hard for Francophone rights. Sometimes there's the perception that Francophones take away jobs from Anglophones. A report on electoral reform was tabled and the government rejected that report. I actually don't have a specific question, but I have a request of you. It would be to write a memorable report. Don't only revisit everything that's been done. We know that Canada is celebrating its 150th birthday, and it's time to update our language laws to take advantage of the online world. Francophones are proud. And in Quebec, an article appeared which said that Acadians, and this is just one example, we talked about this in Manitoba, and we talk about this elsewhere in the country. There is diversity, and people want French to have a higher profile. It would be great if your report talked about our open-mindedness. We want Canadians to understand, especially young people, that it's okay for them to have hashtags in French, to have a Francophone presence online. If you put that in your report, it would have a huge impact. And if you could, through your report, let Canadians know that your report exists, that its message was heard. I don't know if I'm expressing myself clearly, but I think if you tabled an excellent report, it would make a difference, and we would be happy to know that our efforts have borne fruit.
We'd like to be able to say that we've made progress for the 150th anniversary of Canada and that we've moved forward bilingualism in Canada. This is something that I'd really like to see move forward. Your proposal is very interesting, despite the fact that there's only 2 senators before you here today. Senator Tardif is online and is listening, and I'm sure that other senators from the OLLO committee will also be listening. This report, which will be presented by the committee, will also include the youth aspects. And this is the importance that we are giving to your needs. And you said earlier that the future, and we also have to look at the present. The first aspect that we look at is you, the youth. We need to find out what needs you have in your communities. And what are they right now? I remember the time when we fought to have secondary schools financed provincially here in Ontario. When I came, this was adopted, but in Ontario. But you are coming at a time where there's more linguistic or bilingual aspects that are important. And we look at the Official Languages Act that probably doesn't meet your needs of today, but it met needs of the past. So we have to look at all of this and reflect this in our report, and especially the future needs. And we want to make sure we have something up to date for you. So we're going to look at this very carefully and make sure all of this is included. Yes, these challenges are very important because they raise questions about political aspects of official languages. We have to really, when we look at official languages, there's also often political aspects associated with this. What is the responsibility of the federal government, the provincial government, the cities? What are the responsibilities of the municipalities? All of this is part of the ecosystem that has to work. So you talked about this resistance, because provincial government is hesitating because it doesn't want to upset the other official language community. So this is a question I'm asking you. How can we, the federal government, or what should we do in modernizing the OLA to make sure the relationship with provinces and the municipalities is stronger? What means can we use to have a greater impact and to get greater commitment from the provinces? This is something I would perhaps ask you to think about. And as Senator Moncion has said, we're asking your opinions, and that's why we wanted to start by hearing from youth. Often you're very wise. We want to hear about aspects that were different from now than they were in the past. There's the question of our bilingual identity. And some of you have this identity, but what does it mean? What does this bilingual identity mean for the Official Languages Act? And what does it mean for our institutions? How can we bear this in mind? So I'm not going to resume our conversation, but what I've retained till now is that you talked a lot about post-secondary education. You talked a lot about these institutions as an important step. Either they exist in some provinces or don't, but we also have to be open, and we have to say that the education system for those who are rights holders and who also those who want to have access to French immersion programs, we have to talk about the challenges and look how we can modernize the system. You also talked about linguistic insecurity and the hierarchy of the language. In the French language structure, well, I won't talk about English because it's not my specialization, but we think there are some people who speak well and others who speak less well, and some who are francophone and less francophone. So how can we promote diversity and the expression of the French language? That's something you discussed. And the link between language and culture. And this aspect, I'm somewhat perplexed based on what you've said, because on the one hand, when culture is too tightly associated to language, some people feel excluded. And at the same time, when culture is not associated to language, there's a lack of pride and fundamental values among francophones. So I'm not sure how to bring all this together. So this will be the subject for other future conversations. But what you've said to now, these subjects often involve specific recommendations. You want more common spaces, areas to get together for those who live in highly minority communities, to be able to reach out to majority communities for certain events. So that's something we can think about. But we were going to continue to listen to you, what you have to say. I just want to kind of resume what some of the topics you've mentioned. So we're ready for other questions. Thank you very much for what you've had to say. Hello? I'm the director of our youth association in Saskatchewan. Honourable Senator, you said that you're somewhat perplexed between this link between culture and language. The problem is that Canadian culture should be bilingual. We should be building a Canadian culture that includes French. And that's why we're at a crossroads. We're trying to enrich the Canadian fibre to include French, but it should already be there. We should never have to talk about French Canadian or Anglophone culture. We should just be Canadian. From my Francophone culture dates well back to the history of our country, but it's the result of my education, of my culture, my reality. We talk about culture and we wonder, what can we do? We're just a drop in the American Ocean. But if you want to affect change, we really have to work hard as francophones to fight against this American tidal wave. And it starts with education. Sometimes I'm really sad when Caron won the medal. He didn't sing the national anthem in French. If you're really Canadian, we should be bilingual. So we have to stop pretending we're a bilingual country and just really be one. We have bilingual provinces and some people who try to be bilingual. This act has to have teeth. It has to be law. Sometimes I pay... some people have jobs to answer phone lines, and they say hello, and they really don't speak French, or they don't offer their services in French. And I say to myself, what do I do now? Since I was 2, I'm wondering why there's no jobs in French, even though I've spoken French from a young age. We talk about diversity. People say you don't speak French well enough to be bilingual. We have to raise the level of French in our education so everyone feels comfortable to say, yes, I'm Canadian. And let's stop talking about one language or another. We say, I speak Canadian. I can speak both languages at the same time and everyone will understand. I don't want... I have 2 francophone parents, and it will never change my identity. But we can do something. We ask young people to learn science and all sorts of subjects, but they should be able to speak and identify as Canadians. So what have you done to end this division between Anglophones and Francophones? And we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to be more Canadian? Thank you. Thank you very much. Listening to what you have to say and what I am wondering is when we talk about official languages, are we talking amongst ourselves? Is what you're saying that the question of official languages is more the feeling that we can have at times is that this challenge is a minority one, that official languages in Canada don't involve all of Canadians. It only involves minority communities. So if this is true, the vision we have of official languages and what you're describing is true, because most Canadians in Canada, if they don't think that official languages are part of the fundamental values of our country, then they won't believe in the importance of being bilingual. They won't believe it's important to add value to French language or to promote the culture of the French language, etc. So I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at, but I've understood what you've said correctly, is that we shouldn't just modernize and make the modernization of the OLA a question of confrontation between the 2 communities. Let's modernize the OLA and make it a Canadian issue so that we really have a bilingual country. So how to do so? By what means? What would you do tomorrow morning if you had to modernize the OLA? I would make all young people speak French right as soon as they graduate from secondary school. So French obligatory for everyone. We need a national jurisdiction about French. French can be a regional issue, but we really have to get tough on national issues. What we're doing now is not enough for Canadians. We have to... Sometimes people hire Europeans before they hire Canadians because they have better French. People have to know that Canadians have to be on an international level. When you say that the act should have greater teeth, what are you trying to say? I mean that if you're going to be federal government, you should have bilingual service, period. So you have to make things work to make them really bilingual. And yes, even for the Queen. Yes, the Queen is also bilingual. Her children are as well. But yeah, that's more or less it. If you're an agent of the Queen, then you should be speaking French. It's not so hard. Sometimes we make things really complicated. There are laws that we can pass to involve subtitles. I mean, sometimes there are Spanish subtitles in the U.S. Why do we not make it obligatory to have French subtitles on all types of things in Canada? We have to... We talk about the cultural desert that is Saskatchewan. As an organization, we tried to create organizations. If there's 5 people who speak French, we say, yay, yay. We tried to get a CD or an MP3, and there's only 2 songs in French and 10,000 in English. And this is because we haven't added value to our cultural institutions. And we haven't created a place to live in French. We often hear people talk about bilingualism. Do francophones exist in our province? By saying everyone's bilingual, we'll just move to English. No, that's not what we want. We want to have if I tell you, for example, oh, we have beautiful eyes, well, I'm bilingual. That's not what being bilingual really is. Perhaps you could translate the dictionary for the first page to the end. Thank you very much. You've approached this question in a very broad manner, and the OLA should actually have teeth, in your opinion, and it also has to be applied everywhere in all aspects, from music, etc. So this affects agreements that the Canadian government has with other countries. So there's lots of room here to give the Act some teeth. Thank you very much for being here today. Are there any other questions? Yes, hello. Hello, my name's Ariane. I live in Manitoba. I'm from Manitoba. I'm so honored to be with you here today. It's a beautiful opportunity to talk about a subject that we're also passionate about. Just to give you a bit of a background, I was able to spend the summer in Quebec. And right now, Quebec is celebrating the 150th anniversary of Expo 67. And I've mentioned this because it's part of our history. And Expo 67 is where the Quebec identity was really developed. And it's relevant because we no longer talked just about French Canadians. We talked about Quebecers and other francophone minorities outside of Quebec. We felt somewhat less concerned. There was less solidarity because of this identity. And I've mentioned this because the OLA is intended to promote the use of French and enrich the language across Canada, but in terms of Quebec and its relationship with the other provinces, notably in terms of French, it's kind of like ignoring the elephant in the room, because I think we have an inferiority complex. I felt it in 2014 when we went to the Canadian Francophonie Games. I was able to go to the ones in Moncton. People told me about their experience. They're really positive experiences. But there's always this elephant in the room with this, in terms of this inferiority complex. I've met a lot of young Quebecers this summer at events, and they're very open to this idea. Sometimes they just don't know what our issues are, and often they're upset to learn that there are francophone communities outside of Quebec that are ignored. So what I propose to enhance French is to promote interdependence between the provinces and Quebec. We need interdependent francophonie between Quebec and the other provinces. Quebec also needs our input. And I know this issue is very complex in terms of our identity, but I see this as something very important because we're talking about a national challenge in terms of official languages. I'm getting a bit lost in what I'm trying to say, but I think this is important. I don't know if you want to comment on this. For you, when you consider bilingualism, and for us as well, from what I've understood anyway, when we meet Anglophones from Quebec who are bilingual like you and who are bilingual in Quebec as Anglophones, they have exactly the same concerns as you have in your provinces. So we've met these Anglophones within the context of the OLA. your viewpoint raises a very big challenge and a very tough one for francophones outside of Quebec, because we were always somewhat categorized as being outside of Quebec. So this barrier is now being dismantled because young people also want to be included, whether they're Anglophone who speak French in Quebec or Francophones who speak English in Quebec. 30 or 40 years ago, there weren't many people in Quebec who spoke English. And thanks to education, the children of these people who didn't necessarily speak English now speak English. So this situation has allowed us to see an evolution in the language. In some provinces, we've also seen more awareness with regard to bilingualism in Canada. Some people now see this as a big, important challenge. And there are some people who come from Anglophone backgrounds and now speak French. So you will have to make decisions to allow yourselves to increase your knowledge of French and have access to immersion education or education in French. So this type of evolution, not all Canadians can benefit from it. Some people have had experiences that have allowed them to change their way of seeing bilingualism. And so it's what you experience personally that allows you to to form opinions. And you're working on improving the situation and making change. For you, provincial linguistic barriers do not exist. You're all young, whether you speak English, French, Italian, Spanish, you're all young people, and you all have more or less the same needs. So there's this cultural identity that perhaps belonged to another generation, and you have your own cultural identity that you're building based on the needs of today. So there are bridges and links, but what you've stressed as challenges, it's hard to erase the past. When your parents, for example, well, I come from a family that was raised in Ontario, and my mother was Quebecer, and my father was from the north of Ontario, and my mother did not want us to speak English, not one word. We went to school, we didn't have good marks in English, and everyone says, oh, you'll learn English quick, and that's what happened. So, in my opinion, it's better to learn French before we learn English, because English we learn it later anyway, but it's much harder to master the French language, which is much more complex. So there are some serious challenges. These barriers that we see today, in terms of the quality of French that is spoken, yes, you speak French, the quality of this language is important, but it improves with time. It's by speaking that we improve our French, and by exercising that we improve. So this duality does exist. We've created another identity outside of Quebec as francophones, and I say us because we're now more inclusive than in the past. And you've talked a lot about being inclusive. So how can we include this in our Official Languages Act and move further? And that's what we want to see now. And we know that the OLA was created for francophones more than for anglophones. And we know that this was to recognize our rights in the education, government sectors, and on local levels. And we've made progress, but we have other progress to make as well. Perhaps I haven't answered all your questions, but no, that was great, thanks. Quickly, I've heard all the context you've given around this duality and interdependence between Quebec province, which is majority francophone, and the rest of Canada, which is mostly in a minority situation. In Quebec, the official language of the province is obviously French, but Quebec, being part of Canada, is also subject to federal laws. So the OLA will also apply to Quebec. And it also normally targets Anglophone communities in Quebec. But the challenge you mention affects the OLA, but it probably also involves other laws and acts and initiatives on the community level. While there are challenges in Quebec, there are also wonderful adventures in Quebec. Many meetings you can have, get-togethers. And the more we meet and get together and communicate, the more we'll have a better understanding of the Francophone communities in minority settings. So we're happy to share this wealth of French knowledge. So thank you very much for your comments. Thank you. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. I'm sorry. My apologies. No, the gentleman who was there earlier. I wanted to speak up about this universal bilingualism idea. People can see this idea as being a radical one. It's a monumental challenge in terms of logistics and infrastructure, but Canada has a rich history in terms of its pan-Canadian program. And I'm in favor of this idea of bilingualism with a minimum French requirement. The Official Languages Act of Canada was created mostly for Francophones, yes, to preserve our culture. And as Julien mentioned, I think, if we look throughout the continent, we're surrounded by an ocean of American culture. Everything happens mostly in English. If we want to have a universal program, we have to make monumental efforts to. For example, we could have a minimum requirement for French by the end of secondary school. This would be difficult, but it would enrich Canada as a country. And it would enrich the quality of our workforce in Canada. And it would also elevate Canada's position with regard to other countries as well. There are several Anglophones throughout the country who perhaps see learning a second language as a big responsibility. But several generations later, their children will thank these leaders who really perhaps promoted a popular idea that wasn't very popular at the time, but that made sense. Perhaps I'm not the best person to talk about this, but since I'm a Syrian who was born in Montreal, but I would strongly encourage you to talk with the First Nations, as you are doing with us, to talk with the Inuit. The OLA was created 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago now, at a time in history. We are now at a time in history where we're trying to recognize the errors and the crimes of the past. And we have to include them in the new OLA for new services. And I know in some territories, this would be a historical and ambitious event. Yes, thank you. I'd just like to add, I really like the idea of a French requirement for all Canadians. This could make Canada, this could distinguish Canada or set it apart from American culture. This could perhaps be our brand, the Canadian brand, a truly bilingual brand. Because this is what it will take. It's easier to go bottom up than top down. There are a lot of people who are bilingual, who speak both languages. So I really like that idea. Thank you very much for what you said about Natives and First Nations. There is a project to promote Native languages. There are many Native languages in Canada, 63 or around, more or less. So there's also a desire to gradually help these communities to promote their languages and to promote their education. So how will this happen within the OLA? I'm not sure. But I thank you very much for this comment. And yes, we are very concerned by this challenge that affects not only the First Nations, but all Canadians, because there's an enormous wealth in Indigenous language and culture in our country. So we have time perhaps for one last question. 2 minutes. Hello, Senators. My name's Adrien Buet. I'm from PEI, from Astico, and I'm a student at University of Moncton in New Brunswick. I left my province to go to university. I have a few points to make. Since I've been in Moncton, what I see often throughout the country, but I see it in Acadia, people try to guess where you're from by your accent. I like to ask people this, and people always have a hard time guessing that I'm from PEI. We have a lot of influence on our accent. Our teachers most of them aren't really from PEI. Some of them are from Quebec. Some people learn French as a second, third, or fourth language. So we're exposed to various types of French and registers of the language. So that's why our accents can vary from one end of the island to another. It's so our accent adds color to our province. I'm looking for stability in the French world in terms of official languages. There's always different teachers in the education system. They come from different places. Provincial employees often have various backgrounds. And this means that it's good to have several people who are interested in the Francophone community. And I'm very happy to have met these people. However, there's a lack of stability and of constance in this community. And that's something that I would seek in a new take on the Official Languages Act. And what are the root causes of this? Why is there lack of stability? What can we attribute this to? I think there are several factors that come into play. Notably, people who leave the province to go to university or for other reasons. And they often go to urban centers and not rural ones. So this leads people outside of PEI, or sometimes they stay on the island, but there's also often a lack of human resources. That's another problem. So that's why people can't often stay in a French community. Sometimes they just need a break. So this is one of the reasons why there's a lack of stability and there's a lot of turnover. Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. This opens up many doors in terms of what you said. Yes. Yes, thank you. So the question period is now over, and we're going to move on to our conclusions. Yes, it's my turn to speak. Ms. Brossard, I've been asked to say thank you to you all. Yes, we'd like to thank you quite sincerely. I just want to read my notes to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Thank you immensely for your contributions today. I just wanted to say that for people such as Senator Moncion and myself, who are from Francophone communities, the Senate of Canada has the passionate challenge of promoting the Official Languages Act, and we have to look at what needs to be done in their communities. Perhaps it's cliche to say this, but I'll still say it. You're not only the future, but you're also the present of our communities. And this gives us a look into the future, and I'm quite confident because you're imaginative, you're lucid, you have vision. You express yourselves, you've expressed your concerns and your challenges and some solutions. So we hope that your opinions will help orient our study that we're doing and allow us to build solid recommendations for the Official Languages Act. So please stay in contact with us. Our conversation won't end today. By various means, you can contact us. And before wrapping up, I'd like to invite Ms. Sophie Brassard, Vice President, and Ms. Jolien Théret, who is the Treasurer of the FJCF, to say a few words. Thank you very much, Senators. Senator Moncion and Senator Cormier, as the Vice President of the FJCF, we'd like to thank you once again for inviting us here today to hear us with regard to the Official Languages Act. Thank you for listening to us today, and thank you for the importance you've given to French youth in your work in modernizing the OLA. We're very happy to be part of this activity with young people from all areas of Canada, and this issue has a serious impact on the vitality of Francophone communities in minority settings. As you've heard during the various speeches of my colleagues, young people are committed and want to live in a country that respects linguistic diversity and that celebrates linguistic duality. And we have various regional Francophone accents. Young people know that Francophone identity and community don't involve exclusion, but require openness and diversity. And that's why our association clearly supports the efforts you are making to modernize the OLA. We have to look at the equal quality of communications and services offered and establish criteria if there is significant demand, and we have to clarify consultations for the enforcement of this law. We believe that the Government of Canada has to define what it is to be a Francophone so it can have a more inclusive definition of Francophonie, as the Government of Ontario must do. So I'll now give the floor to my colleague. Thank you, Jillian. Thank you.
As a francophone network promoting French in Canada, we think it would be important for the federal government to remind citizens the importance of linguistic duality, which is the cornerstone of the creation of our country, with a national campaign promoting all of our actions throughout Canada. Linguistic duality is one of our greatest assets. We should actively promote this duality as a benefit both socially and economically, so that Canadians are aware of the importance of celebrating our official languages, of our different accents and communities. As part of our National Action Plan, the government should launch a national campaign promoting linguistic duality in Canada. It is adamant, it is very important that we promote our different accents and languages, and that we build bridges between our communities. It is important to modernize the Official Languages Act by taking into account the different viewpoints from everyone. We hope to have been helpful in your research and study, and we thank you for asking for our opinion so that our Francophone community and all Canadians become engaged citizens. Thank you very much for your interest, and we will closely follow your work and your study to modernize the Official Languages Act. Thank you very much. It was a privilege for Senator Cormier and I to be with you this afternoon and listen to all your insights, your experiences, and everything you had to say. Once again, to reiterate what Senator Cormier said, please, if you have other comments or written documents, please submit them to us, and we'll be able to share that information with our colleagues in the Languages Committee. So thanks once again. It was a privilege, and I hope you will have great meetings in the coming days. I hope you'll have fun and that you'll find all the solutions to our different challenges in Canada. And thank you on behalf of all the millions of francophones and francophiles following us on Facebook Live. Thank you very much, and see you soon. Thank you.